15. We'll begin reading in verse number 11. And he, Jesus, said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. When he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. For the last couple of weeks, we have been kind of watching this progression of going from living in the Father's house, having fellowship with Him, to being down where we're having dinner with the pigs. And we began by looking at it all starting with being discontented, not happy with what the Father has given to us, maybe thinking that He's holding something back from us, not giving us everything that we ought to have. And so this younger son said to his father, I wish you were dead. Now give me my inheritance so I can go and do what I want to do. The father has a little different response than I think I would have. He says, okay. I'd be like, man, somebody's looking for a rear end whooping somewhere. But he says, all right, that's fine, if that's what you want to do. And so he gives him his inheritance. And this young man, as we looked last week, went into a far country. And it tells us that he wasted, verse number 13, he wasted his substance. And I stop and I think about all the talents and abilities that God has given to every single one of us. The blessings, the homes, the jobs, the abilities God has given to us for a purpose, that is to serve Him, to honor and glorify Him. And yet so often we're like this young son and we waste what it is that God has given to us. We live in the greatest nation of the world. We are a people who are blessed beyond every other nation, and yet we waste so much. And this morning I want us to look down as we look in verse number 14, it tells us when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And so he lives a life, hey, it's party, it's whatever I want, I'm going to get, I'm going to do what I want to do. He wastes everything, it tells us, and then a famine comes up. He's not expecting it. He hasn't prepared for it. It comes up, and it tells us he is in want. He's in need. And God is trying to get his attention. He's trying to get a hold of him. And right there, he could have said, hey, you know what? I'm going home. I'm going back home. I mean, the servants have food, as he already knows that as he comes to himself later on. But he doesn't go home there. He's not willing yet to humble himself and say, Dad, you know what? I made a mistake. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. He's not willing to humble himself. And instead of humbling himself and saying, God, you know what? Forgive me. I made a mistake. He tries to fix it himself. And we often do that. And I include myself in this. We get ourselves into trouble, and rather than going to God and saying, God, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, I should have looked to you, I should have listened to you, we try to figure it out for ourselves. We try to work our own way out of the situation. And so he begins to be in want. In verse number 15, it tells us he went, and that's not the problem. He should have went home. Instead, it tells us he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. Rather than going home to the country and the place and the home that he belonged in, he went and joined himself to a citizen of this faraway country. And he looks around and says, all right, how can I work myself out of this situation? What can I do while I'm here? And it tells us that that is the point where he gets to this place where he wants to eat what the pigs are eating. The filth, the corn husks, and whatever else that they feed him. All because he's trying to figure it out himself. rather than looking to God, rather than being willing to humble himself and say, you know what, Lord, I have made a mistake and I'm sorry for it, and just owning up to it. On Wednesday nights, we started a series talking about King Saul and King David and King Solomon, and we pointed out that Saul was a king who started off good in the beginning. But he started making bad choices, started making mistakes, and when confronted, he would never admit it. He'd never say, I messed up. He'd never say, I shouldn't have done that. He'd never say, I'm sorry. Instead, he'd point the finger somewhere else. Well, it was the people's fault. It was the enemy's fault. It was the circumstances. And instead of saying, you know what, I made a mistake, he tried to figure it out for himself. He tried to blame everybody else. And here this young son is the same exact way. Rather than just saying, God, I have made a mistake and I've failed, please forgive me, we want to try to maybe ignore it. We want to try to work it out our own way. Rather than going back and saying, Father, you know what, I've made a mistake. And often things get worse than they have to get. And we sink lower than we have to sink, because rather than right there saying, God, I'm sorry, please forgive me, we try to work it out our own way. Rather than going home, he joins himself to a citizen of this country. And things get worse. It gets to the point in verse number 16 that he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. Here he is having dinner with the pigs. Why? Because he's discontented. He's not happy with what the Father had given. Because he wasted it all. He wasted what God did give to him. He wasted what the Father gave to him. And he was too proud. He wasn't willing to say, I made a mistake. He wasn't willing to say, I've messed up, I'm sorry. So now he's having dinner with the pigs. And if you're here this morning, God is trying to get your attention. If you're not walking with him, if you're not living as you ought to live, God is trying to get your attention. Don't make that mistake. Don't let it get to the point where you hit the absolute bottom and you're having dinner with the pigs for you to come to yourself. Verse number 17, he didn't come to himself until finally it hit rock bottom. When he got there and wasted everything, that didn't work. When the famine comes and he has absolutely nothing and he's in want, that doesn't work. It's not until he's down there staring that pig in the face, wishing he could eat what the pig is eating. There's no lower place to sink than that. I mean, you drive down these country roads and you can smell it before you get there. There's not a place you can go lower than staring that pig in the face, wishing you were eating what they're eating. He gets to the point where he can go absolutely no lower. That's when he comes to himself. Sometimes that's where we got to get. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I challenge you this morning to stop and think about the life that you're living. Where is it that you are? Are you in a close fellowship with the Father? Doing what you ought to do? Loving him and serving him because you love him, having a great fellowship? Or are you somewhere along this progression? Have you grown to a place of discontentment in your life? You're not happy with the things that God has given to you. Not happy with the circumstances around your life. And you say, you know what, I want more and I've got to have more. Maybe you're at the point where you are just wasting what it is that God has given to you. You're wasting the talents, you're wasting the treasures, you're wasting the time that God has given to you. It's time to turn around. It's time to go back home to the Father. For some of you, you are at rock bottom, you are at the place where you're having dinner with the pigs, or you are very close to it. It's time to come to yourself. It's time to realize and understand the blessings and the fellowship that come with having a right relationship with the Father. And as we talked about at the end of last week, we notice in verse number 20, as he finally comes to himself and says, hey, I'm going back home. It tells us that he arose and came to his father, but when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And God is there waiting. The Heavenly Father is there. He's watching for you every single day. The fact that you're underneath the sound of this message right here is proof that He is watching and waiting and encouraging you to come back home. This father was out there every single day, probably all day, every day, would go out and just watch and wait for his son. As soon as he saw that son cross the horizon, he ran to meet him. And you notice he doesn't kick him while he's down. He doesn't scold him. He doesn't say, I told you so. He has compassion. He hugs him. He kisses him. He welcomes him back into right fellowship. And no matter where you are in this progression, He is watching and waiting for you to come home.